I'm about to talk about something that has increasingly become coded as a right wing topic. And I must admit, here at Von Blog, we don't give a fuck anymore. When I talk about social reproduction, people think I only mean that in abstract, most grandiose notions of gender on the basic level. And I'm also talking about child rearing, education, superstructural things that inform the base of society, in so much that they reinforce and reify already existing social divisions. Now, you can get mad at me for talking like a grad student on this, as people often do. Um, but I'm going to talk about something that's happening to working class, specifically working class men, but also general society, that we have to look at and be honest about. And that is the declining rates of literacy and learning in general. And that's not just the traditional literacy, it's also media literacy, which has declined. But also, people confuse the two. When I will go and say literacy's decline, they'll talk about filter bubbles and propaganda and cognitive biases and the stuff that the IDW crowd have been talking about and the New Atheists talked about in the aughts. The problem is, cognitive biases are relatively consistent, they are a human norm. You cannot explain declines in literacy off of cognitive bias. All right. Two, filter bubbles also imply the ability to have enough literacy to be filtered into a bubble by something beyond your social contact. So again, when we talk about declines in literacy, that can explain the decline in media literacy, but it can't explain the decline in traditional literacy, numeracy, etc. Now, I'm not here to say education will fix all our problems, but Marxists did in the past, not just because of their own Whiggish bias in the Second International, believe that the necessity of the socialization and basic literacy skills needed of a non-agricultural workforce would mean that the social skilling that made socialism possible and the educational achievements to democratize society possible would be done basically by the needs of the factory. This was Koski's proposition. Now, he probably should have read Marx a little closer, but nonetheless, that was his proposition. Today, we have historically high graduation rates in the United States. In 21 and 22, the graduation rate was 87%. That is up 7% from the prior high. In the early teens in 2011 of 80%, and it's up, and that is up from the 74% that was the graduation rate in 1990. We've seen an increase of graduation across racial and ethnic demographics, although we've also seen a massive decline in men going to college of all races. College is increasingly a feminized proposition. And we have also seen the decline of blue-collar work for said men not going to college, with a tenth of men who are blue-collar on disability, et cetera, et cetera. We would like to tell ourselves it's because they're stay-at-home dads, but 25% of these men are not partnered and do not even report having consistent friends. See the report on men done by the Brookings Institute by Richard Reeves for more information that Ryan Zagraf talked about over in Jacobin and we've covered here on the channel. Nonetheless, I want to get into the irony of this historically high graduation rates. Because, like we've seen with blue-collar men closing the gap with blue-collar men of color, blue-collar men in general, and thus blue-collar white men, because white people are still 70% of the population, roughly. What one sees is pretty much this. The gap between the races has decreased because white men who do not have college educations have dropped in their life prospects precipitously. And there have been some drops for men of color in the last 20 years, but they've been around the 2 to 3% range, whereas the drops for people who are coded as white and blue collar has been around 15 to 20% in things like employment, purchasing power, etc. Now, when people are telling you, and Democrats are telling you, this is all about the price of eggs, and how can Trump be able to do this other than misogyny? And while undoubtedly misogyny and racism is part of this, it's hard to explain that it's not the only part of it. And in fact, all these things exist in a multi-determinant feedback loop. So you can scream racism or you can scream economy without looking at things that the Brookings Institute itself has pointed out. When economic times are bad, people start banding up and blaming out groups they see as outsiders as part of the problem. And racial groups are some of the first groups that people see as outsiders. And that's not just with white people, by the way, that's across the board. So we shouldn't take that as normative. We shouldn't take that as a given. We should just take it as a thing that currently exists. Just like the feminization of education is very ironic. Administration is still predominantly male at all levels of education. Male professors still outperform female professors. And in fact, despite the feminization of the institution of higher education's where earning differentials and all that really show up. I can show you stats on that if you want to believe it. Even though more women are entering higher ed at all levels, there is still massive differentials that cannot just be explained by choices and what they study anymore, particularly when so many men are not entering college at all. But why? You see, one of the ironies of our age is, despite this historic graduation rate, in 1990, when the graduation rate was only 74%, the average worker, the average person, net aggregate, regardless of their level of education in the United States, read at an 8th grade reading level. Now, those reading levels are based on Lexile scores. And while that's kind of like, oh, are we comparing like to like? After the 70s, we are. It's hard to do historical comparisons before the 1950s because we didn't measure this stuff in the same way. But by the time you have universal access to secondary education in the United States around the 1970s, and we started studying secondary education and standardizing the means in which we studied it, it means that we also have standardized terms. So after the 1970s, we can meaningfully talk about what we mean by literacy rates and these grade level equivalents. So according to the National Center for Education Statistics, the average reading level in the United States, and this was reflected also in the guidelines put out by most newspapers, was between a 7th and 8th grade level. Middle school, mind you, not high school level, but still compared to today, where the average is below a 5th grade, it's a 5th grade level. That's a big deal. The average is below a 5th grade level, meaning that the average worker, the average American, regardless of their social status, now we all know that this average American does not exist, so we're actually really talking about workers here, are reading at a 5th grade level. One of the reasons I get mad at people who tell me, oh, workers can't read, you can't talk this bullshit, is that they can't now. But they could in the past. Now, pre-World War II, it's very hard to get a real sense of what we're talking about with literacy. These terms were not standardized. These tests were not standardized. But today, with the highest historic graduation level we've ever seen, on every metric that we have, the International PISA tests, which gauge literacy, the ACT and SAT, general literacy inventories, the Iowa score test, the NWEA test, all these things show significant declines in basic reading across the board, both in school and when inventoried by adults out of school, and this is reinforced in society by the way we write towards the average. So the feedback is negative. We've been focusing on this channel, and I've done in the Patreon a discussion about how elite people are often not able to read novels. And this is not because they don't have the comprehension skills. This is because they don't have the executive function. But we're now talking about regular ass people not reading as much. Now, this is an inversion from just 10 to 15 years ago. But is it surprising anyone now that you have people, even college educated people, reading YA well into their 30s and 40s? When you think about the average reading level being about that sophisticated. Now, I am a specialist in literacy. For those of you who don't know my day job, I'm a teacher. I have taught teachers, and I've taught English education and English language learning, which are not the same things, by the way, from 6th grade all the way to graduate school in South Korea. I have taught at elite institutions and elite private schools and public schools and poor charter schools. I've done across the board, and I've also taught people who are in rancheros in Mexico how to read in Spanish and English. And I don't even speak Spanish very good, as people who can hear me know. Furthermore, there are other things this is systemically indicative of. Assaults on teachers, particularly middle school teachers and inner city teachers, has gone up dramatically in the past 10 years. The attempt to replace traditional education and not suspend has been replaced with nothing. Now, suspension doesn't work. All the prior use of suspension did, after the changes around No Child Left Behind, was to penalize schools for reporting it, because it disproportionately affected people who were from broken homes. And this was a feedback loop which reinforced negative racial, ethnic, and economic stereotypes. However, it was replaced with restorative justice. But actual restorative justice is really hard to do. It requires monitoring kids, restoring the relationship, teams that are devoted to doing it, etc., etc. And we don't have enough people to staff what we have now. So what happens with that is the administration try to just alleviate the problem. And this even goes up to progressive legislatures. We've seen this in California, where they just remove the ability to remove disruptive students from the classroom because it is unfair to the disrupted student. Never mind what happens to the rest of the classroom because of their behavior. And we've seen up to 6% of teachers have now been assaulted by students. Now, I don't want to return to the 90s and aughts, particularly the aughts, zero tolerance, where if a person assaulted me, they would immediately go to jail. That's not what I'm talking about here. The school to prison pipeline was awful, but we really have undone it. We just changed it. It's subtler now. So, what do we do? And my answer with most progressives and liberals, and even many leftists, okay, and I'm not a believer in current traditional education models. I don't believe in the banking concept of education, although I will tell you, despite what you may hear, direct instruction does work, particularly in the preliminary stages of education. And anyone who's ever watched a kid knows that. You model something for them directly, you explain it to them directly, and then you give them a chance to practice it without risk. You want to teach your kid to do chores? That's how you do it. You make it fun, you make it interesting, but you also make it something that has consequences. Have fun with your mom, or she gets out the chancla. All right? That's how you learn. Mostly benefit with some stick. But we in America, like all benefits, no stick, are sometimes just neither, none of the above, just standards being passed down. And this is not even getting to some things specifically I've talked about with men, and I don't talk about this on the show. But with young boys, the ranges of kids learning usually are relatively large. But since No Child Left Behind, we've had very specific grade specific targets, which means that we have more and more standards that we have to teach with less variance on when a young child can adjust to the situation. So they do get left behind, ironically. But we keep pushing them up. In many states, you can't hold back kids until they're in high school. Social promotion is just the norm unless the parent asks for something otherwise. That's definitely true out here in the West. So the idea that changing the stakes really helps has been kind of disproven. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this. Phonics, for example, is often blamed for a big shift, and phonics is probably what we have from John Hattie and other people, slightly more effective as a way to teach reading because it teaches proper decoding, kind of. And the kind of here is why there was a debate in the first place. This was educators listening to the linguist, because English is not a language with consistent phonetic rules, because it has origins probably as a pidgin, if not a pidgin, at least a hybrid language or a Creole, between languages that don't share grammar or phonetic rules. And when the grammar and phonetic rules were imposed upon English to standardize it, particularly in Victorian England, they tried to base it off of Latin, even though the core of the language is Germanic. Now, most of the vocabulary is Latinate, but nonetheless, Frisian and Scandinavian and High German are the closest relatives to Old English, which means phonics doesn't consistently work, and some whole language decoding is necessary. And the debate was, what was the trade-off between focusing on phonics and whole language decoding? Well, now after running with whole language for most of the states, although not all of them, for about a decade and a half, we know that the trade-offs are probably better going with phonics. But again, it's not obvious, and it doesn't explain some of the problems. One of the leaps that you have to make between 5th and 8th grade understandings of reading, it's not just Lexile store, but also your ability to draw inferences, to make sense of the information that you have. We don't have evidence of that anymore. What we see now is people by and large can't do it, which is why they are so given to cognitive biases, etc. They're using heuristics that are undertrained. It's not because they're stupid. People haven't become dumber, not in the sense of innate capacity. In fact, in theory, technology should enable more innate capacity, because there's always a trade-off when you change tech. Plato wasn't wrong when he was complaining about writing reducing memory. It does. But the amount of access you get from being able to decode and not having to memorize, the amount of things that opens up for you is more than your brain could ever hold. So the trade-off is worth it. But when things like AI, it's not clear that it is worth it, because AI is actually dependent on the sum set of all human literacy already existing. Now, that still doesn't explain why the elites are dumb, Varn, and you're right, it doesn't. Complexity does. The amount of complex knowledge needed to run complex systems means that specialization is inevitable. But specialization comes at a cost of general knowledge, which means you off-site more and more of your thinking to other experts, but you don't have the ability to adjudicate their expertise, even as a smart person. You are too focused on what you know, which is increasingly why journalists often make up the generalists in our society. They are educated to be able to talk in multiple people and write in multiple ways, but they're often educated quite shallowly. Since journalism has become a rather elite game, it has done so because it is not a consistent enough living in the early stages for non-elites to risk doing it. And this is happening to all sorts of fields, even teaching. There were more black teachers in the 80s and 90s than now. Now, some of that had to do with the fact that some of them were actually teachers for segregated schools in the middle of the 20th century. Some of that had to do with the fact that you could be a teacher with less qualifications. You still had to pass the test and get hired, but you often could be a teacher in the 70s with as little as an associate's degree, depending on the state that you were in. Now, some states you need a master's and multiple certifications to even begin the teaching. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it increases the investment involved. And until recently, most states do not pay people for their student teaching, aka their unpaid internship that they actually have to pay for, where they do free labor for the state. Well, journalism has the same problem. You have to often take very low paying internships or no paying internships to build up the resume to do it, which means you need to come from wealth to be able to do it. The poverty of grad school that was been made up fun of since the 90s is actually directly related to the fact it's become a fail son elite activity. So you have that, which means you have people who are too highly specialized and often focusing on things that get a lot of interplay in journals, because again, what the universities care about is not educating the students. We've already talked about this. Universities' income streams come from the hospital and the endowments and almost everything but the students, particularly as we started defunding that at the state level, and there was more and more incentives to, say, meet diversity quotas that were internally opposed by taking international students who also paid way higher tuition to compensate for the fact that you weren't getting as much compensation for the state for the low tuition you were taking for internal students, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a plethora of perverse incentives in higher education, but we don't look at the perverse incentives in secondary and primary education. The cost, as I've said many, many times, in secondary and primary education has doubled. It's mostly rent seeking, both the renttopic and the grifter kind, both kickback and not. It's mostly rent seeking. I went to an educational technology conference, which was a $600 a person ad paid for by the state, where we got sold things that were to contract more money from the state, and it was a conference for education. The research room for the academic research and the conference was one room of about 50. It's a major industry. Furthermore, admin, not just site admin, not just principals and assistant or vice principals, but admin in general has doubled since No Child Left Behind, because the paperwork requires to document the money that you get from the state has doubled. But once you have those jobs, it's hard to get rid of them. And also, it's at the place that people make decisions about the jobs are at. So you can see how this goes. So you get less for your dollar because more of it's going to prove how we do these things for the government. But ironically, the tests have set a bad set of incentives where we don't teach full text anymore. When we do, we have to deal with multiple cultural groups who have increasingly censorious implications. And you're both thinking, oh, it's the other political team. Both sides like censorship. They just censor different things. The thing about American culture is both sides are snowflakes. I can tell you because I've lived elsewhere. So we have contesting cultural groups who want us to raise their kids for them and replicate their social values as a site of social reproduction. because they can't do it. They're working too much in most cases. But they don't agree on what that should be. Furthermore, we had to meet these tests, but now that the tests are go away, the only thing that's left to adjudicate by is graduation rates. Well, that's the easiest thing to do. You just lower the standards, and people do all the time. But it reminds me of a debate I had with a teacher when I was in 11th grade. I was complaining that 7th grade seemed really low for an education since we required people to go to high school, and that it made sense for it to be that low in the 40s and 50s since the average person could leave school at the end of what in Latin countries is called secundaria, what we call junior high, around 8th or 9th grade. My grandfather had an 8th grade education. He read pretty prolifically. No, he wasn't reading some stuff like uncles from his wife's family did, who have buildings named after them in Chapel Hill. But nonetheless, he read pretty prolifically. He was an avid reader. So I get offended when people say, well, why are you not talking to the workers like that? But I have to admit that today, the assumption is accurate that the average worker is going to read at a 5th grade level. Now, there's always 50% above the average and 50% below the average. That's how math works. Right? Averages are relative. You always need to remember that. But that means there's a whole lot of people who don't even read that well. And it's a crapshoot. Whereas in 1990, when I was 10 years old, I could assume that even a person who did not graduate from high school read at a 7th or 8th grade level, which means they could at least do basic inferences. And people wonder why, increasingly, we have a politics of memes. Now, the causes for this, like I said, can't just be phonics, because phonics is about decoding. It isn't going to explain why people can't make inferences. But it does link spoken language to written language more clearly. It is kind of the bridge between spoken and written languages and phonetic languages. Like if you're in an ideogrammic language, it doesn't really work. See Chinese, but it works for us. However, it doesn't mean that people can read deeply or extensively or intensively. And I can tell you what I mean by that. Close reading has become drawing inferences from things because that's how the Common Core defines it. It's not really what people mean by it at higher levels. It's more advanced than that. But it is a very specific thing. But we can also talk about the way in which this situation means that people are getting ripped off for their tax money. Now, we can say that tax money doesn't really fund anything. We can go for the MMT stuff. But basically, a social good that used to at least get you an eighth grade capacity now gets you a 5th grade capacity. And we can say it's specifically the social good, and we couldn't in 1990 because only 74% of the population had a high school diploma. Now it's 87%. And we are talking about that like it's a progressive good at the same time that literacy and numeracy declines. If you are a leftist enabling that, and you're then talking about the Soviet Union, this is probably why you get tricked on theodicies to explain your failure, other than maybe that you're just not as big or in a cognitive bubble and don't know what other people say because you've created massive defense walls because all politics to you are basically a fandom. And it's mostly about mustache versus non-mustache aesthetics, and of which you will automatically call anyone who does not share your worldview some kind of CIA op because you literally can't imagine that people don't agree with you on certain things or that you're historically ignorant. And yes, a lot of people are propagating anti-communist propaganda. A lot of people are tied into these ops, but it doesn't explain all or even most of what's going on. And the reason why you believe that is because you don't know why you're losing. and you don't have the capacity for it. And it's probably not even your fault. So if you come at this ideology belief system first, which is very not materialist in the first place, you need to start asking yourself a question. Am I part of the problem? Do I actually understand enough of what's going on? Am I just reading things that fit my bubble? Do I understand what I'm reading and can draw all the inferences implied by what it said? A lot of you can't. Just gonna be put it out there. A lot of you can't. I have college educated friends who say that I talk over their head. It's the biggest complaint about me on Reddit. And that's why people are surprised to learn I have a working class background. I am highly educated. I am no longer blue collar, and I don't pretend to be. I'm not putting on. There are people who are famous who are like academics who put on the like, oh, I was raised blue collar, and they were. I was raised working class in the British sense, and they were. But they haven't been that most of their lives. And they don't talk like that, and they don't reinforce like that. They have the habitus of that of their childhood and the trauma of that. But part of this is not looking at where they are in the cultural world themselves. The being a fail son elite when you are not really a fail son and you had to work your ass off for it is kind of a bum deal. Education is not the fix, but it is an indication of the problem. And the problems here are overdetermined, meaning I cannot say one thing is causing this. Social media causes it. Video technology causes it. AI causes it. 1,000 things cause it, but the trends way predate AI. They even predate social media. And initially, social media led to an increase of literacy because you had to read to use it with the blogs. And then they commoditized it in a particular way that downplayed that. And they've made decisions to reinforce video content, which, by the way, is why you hear me as opposed to me taking the time to write this stuff out, which I am going to eventually do. But let's be honest, this is my natural way of engaging. I'm a teacher. I'm used to lecturing. I'm also a writer, but I'm actually primarily a poet. So, if you have basic numeracy and basic literacy and some basic mechanical skills, you can learn a ton. And it's something we should be doing and focusing on, but it's not sexy and not something you can easily do with just videos. Videos presuppose you have the literacy and stuff to find the videos, to train the algorithm to give the videos to you, etc., etc., etc. One of the things, if you found me, you probably have a certain education level, and frankly, the stats back that up. It is your job in some ways to skill people. And I don't just mean condescendingly educate them on theory. There is a commenter, a worker, now I know he's a worker, who often comes at me for the, dictatorship of the proletarian being a very unpopular phrase. And I'm like, well, we need to understand it because we need to understand what Marx is talking about. We're not talking about democracy the way most people are talking about it. We're not talking about everyone getting a vote. We're not talking about just putting the working class in power so that they can just run things the way they are now, but more worker friendly. That is not what we're talking about. And you have to understand that. Just rebranding it is a superficial way to deal with that. Now, I admit dictatorship of the proletariat after the middle of the 20th century and the change of the meaning of dictatorship is one of the worst slogans we can possibly have, but you need to understand it. I'm not here to die on the hill that that's maybe what we should call it, but you need to understand it. And general literacy means if I just try to change what we think the word is to make it mass appealing, it also means you probably don't understand or agree on what it means. And so everything becomes a site of contested semantics. And I can't think of anything worse than that. And if people aren't skilled enough to come to mutual conclusions about that, and we just kind of have to hoodwink them with the prestidigitation of words, then I don't know. Yes, workers don't like grad school words. They'd probably like to understand them and not be condescended to. No, a lot of those words aren't even necessary, but some of them are. Do we have to use them as our slogans? No, but slogans are never good enough. Slogans are a passive, consumeristic way to push politics as lifestyle. Fuck that. You have seen where that gets you. Nowhere. Are with people sobbing more over an election than when 1 million Americans died of fucking COVID? People defending democracy as the president going out tries to accelerate a war. This is a canary in a coal mine for both complexity issues and its decadent effects. And I'm tired. I am fucking tired of people saying that the complications of our society, be they from capitalism, and I put capitalism in air quotes because we don't agree on what that even is, are the left or the right or whoever your enemy that you are the day is causing these problems for you when you cannot come up with a positive vision that would enable you to fix them. I am tired of us then saying that we should defend the maladaptive and health destroying effects of consumer corporate capitalism as something we are entitled to as an individual right, when these are social problems. And because they are social problems, individual shaming does not work and is cruel. But we should not tell people that what is happening to them is okay and we should just be fine with it. And oh, well, you didn't need it anyway. If that is what the left is, then that is not going to be attractive to most workers and most people. And I guarantee the worker who told me that maybe I should not call it dictatorship of the proletariat because dictatorship has bad connotations for good reason, and proletariat's a nerd word. Well, he's right in comparison to that shit. People know when you condescend to them. People find me condescending all the time because I am annoying. And it's usually liberal people who are like, why are you being so? Because they're not used to people talking to them directly. They're used to deference and they're used to people not, they'll take smugness over direct hostility. That's not serving them very well. And it isolates them to people who just blow smoke up their ass. Don't you become one of them. Protect your peace, protect your intelligence, protect your fucking mind. Don't let people gaslight you anymore. The economy is harder to deal with than in 1980, and people are selecting stats, so you miss that. And I don't even think they're doing it on purpose because maybe it is better relative to 5 years ago. But if you look at costs from 20 or 40 and the generational cycles that we experience life, it's definitely not true. But the upper middle class aren't affected by that as much. So they don't see it. And oh my God, does the left have a listening to upper middle class interest level problem? And so much of the left means anything. But most of the people throw the left out as an idea, replace it with their own bullshit and common assumptions, and usually don't want to admit that they're actually kind of reactionary and they just don't want to look at certain things either. There is no way out but through, and you skill and you do the work. And I don't care what you call yourself if you do it. That's the important thing. I no longer feel the need to kowtow these motherfuckers anymore in any of these weird cliques. Take care. Protect your peace. Like and subscribe. Hit the bell. There's all kinds of new patrons. I actually haven't announced new supporters, so I probably should do that, even though this is from November and this is coming out probably in January because I record way ahead of time. But let me do my due diligence to the people that I owe due diligence to. I would like to thank my new supporters. Jordan S., Lindsay K., Lawrence P., Red Wolf, Mark M., and David S. Thank you all for your support. I think David maybe runs a channel. All right. Protect your peace. And don't let people gaslight you that things aren't getting bad. They are. And it's not just because of fucking Trump.